First of all, want to thank you for coming and to invite you, please, to correct me where I am wrong, because this is a controversial subject on which there are many quite legitimately different perspectives, and I am conscious that in my initial presentation I will be covering it rather hastily and will be missing out a good deal. So please do not begin your comments with what you failed to say was. I know, but please do just get on with the job of adding to the conversation, which I hope to initiate. And I say all this especially to Bernard Liu, whose kind initial comments modestly failed to recognize the extent to which he himself has been involved in writing about war, and that encompasses necessarily the causes of war. He has also written, interestingly, on the subject of accidental war, which is a phenomenon which has been somewhat neglected in some of the literature. Now, I'm sorry to say that I have perpetrated a set of PowerPoint slides. Don't worry, there aren't two, although they've already appeared. I'll see if I can operate this machine as necessary, but I will really only use the PowerPoint slides so you know roughly where you are in my remarks. Now, this presentation will be in 5 main stages. That's right. I want first of all to highlight the danger of simplification in this whole subject. There's a great history of simplification in it. Then I want to identify some, but it certainly won't be all, the causes of war. Then to discuss the decline in international war since 1945, to say something about the problems of the post-Cold War order, including the point that Dr. Liu just made, that it led to the emergence of a belief that war was now either outdated or so completely different from earlier wars that we had to think afresh about it. And then lastly, if I get time, I will say something about the fears, I should say, of major war, which exist at the present day. I should start by making the obvious, boring, pedantic point, but one that is sometimes forgotten, that it takes at least 2 sides to make a war, and that there are many uses of force that might be thought to provoke a war but don't quite. A typical example, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, in common parlance, that wasn't treated as a war. It was treated rightly as an occupation and an annexation. But it was only when there was resistance to it by an international coalition led by the United States and assisted by the government of Kuwait, among many others, only then was there anything that we would recognize as an actual war. So you're already dealing with the complexity of the relation between 2 or more states being at the heart of war. And incidentally, I will not limit myself purely to interstate war in these remarks, but will encompass civil wars and various wars that lie in between civil war and international war. Now, on the dangers of simplification, I'm going to begin by noting that academic studies of the last generation, since, let us say, the mid-80s, have generally and in my view entirely rightly, avoided the reductionist approach of blaming everything on one or a very few alleged causes. As Geoffrey Blainey, an Australian academic, wrote in a fine study on the causes of war that looked way back to 1700 and right up to the then present, he wrote this: "To analyze war is to enter an arena which is already crowded with entrenched assumptions about why nations fight. In that arena, contradictory ideas seem to live together peacefully. Hundreds of books and articles put forward their own interpretation and ignore the others. Among historians, and they have written more about war than political scientists, anthropologists, or members of any other discipline, most controversies hinge on detailed causes of particular wars rather than on wider assumptions." And it is indeed historians, and I should confess here, my training for my first degree was as a historian. It is historians who have played the largest part in exploring the causes of particular wars. Michael Howard, the distinguished historian of war, who also had been a distinguished soldier in World War II and is still mercifully with us, he emphasized that wars have generally resulted from rational decisions taken by leaders on both sides in a conflict. He wrote these interesting words. This is writing in 1981. "In general, men have fought during the past 200 years neither because they are aggressive nor because they are acquisitive animals, but because they are reasoning ones, because they discern or believe they discern or believe that they can discern dangers before they become immediate, the possibility of threats before they are made." So it's that notion of the thinking, calculating man who believes, and it is mostly men, it has to be said, who believes that they can, they may need to wage war because of the very nature of a situation. Now, I want to remind you that we are not only the inheritors of that recent tradition of thinking quite hard about the causes of war, but we're also inheritors of an older Enlightenment tradition, which in my view is much more problematic when it comes to discussing the causes of war. The Enlightenment thinkers, if I can generalize wildly about characters as various as Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, many others, they tended to have a view of war as being the result of monarchical systems. Monarchs are the problem, and monarchs are an inheritance from an earlier age. They are a sort of superstition. The sooner we can get rid of monarchical systems, the better. And monarchs regard soldiers as mere playthings. They don't identify with them. They don't suffer in war. That this is the common set of assumptions of Enlightenment philosophers, and they were keen, really, to limit the number of causes of war. Indeed, very often just to see the one. Let me give you one example from the Enlightenment as an illustration of the simplicities of this approach. Jeremy Bentham, famous utilitarian philosopher, still sitting there presiding over events at University College London, lived from 1748 to 1832, and he is a fine example of that mixture of brilliance and narrow-mindedness that characterized many Enlightenment thinkers. He listed 12 causes of war, and before you rush to the conclusion that he must therefore have been a genuine pluralist, I should say that no less than 10 of them are claims caused by the interests or pretensions of sovereigns. So 10 out of 12 causes of war were to do with the existence of the institution of kings or emperors or whatever. He failed completely to consider such causes of war as the collapse of government, power vacuums, ethnic divisions within states, or dogmatic revolutionary enthusiasm. None of those featured in his simplicities about what caused war. And let me quote directly from what he said when he discussed one of them, injuries caused on account of religion. He said, "The difference between religion and no religion, however grating, is not nearly as irritating as that between one religion and another. Means of prevention, to ensure that there are not clashes of religion, is simply," he listed as progress of toleration, a 3-word solution to the problem of, if not all war, at least a large number of wars. Well, it's nice to think that the problem of religious war was sorted by advocating the progress of toleration, but needless to say, the Bentham's approach looks pretty antique and dated now, and his downplaying of the conflict between religion and no religion looks particularly dated, considering the centrality of that issue in, for example, the campaign in Afghanistan against Soviet occupation in the 1990s, and of course the element of conflict between religion and no religion in many contemporary movements. Now, in actual fact, the place of religion in war has proved to be much more multifaceted than Bentham presumed. Now, it is true that there is always a question when you're dealing with religion of whether the issue at hand, the cause of conflict, is the religion itself, or whether that's simply a sort of label that is affixed to a community that also coheres for other reasons to do with its sense of being a security community. And those issues always have always arisen in conflicts with a religious dimension. It arose in Northern Ireland during the Troubles in the 70s, 80s and early 90s, in Bosnia in the 90s, in Syria in this century. One could go on. Clearly, that question of exactly how much religion is an independent factor or is merely a reflection of other considerations, you can argue about until the cows come home. But what you don't need to argue about is the dismissive approach to religion as somehow being easily solved as a part of the mix that leads to conflict. That idea is, it seems to me, well and truly out of date. Now, a word about some causes of different types of cause of war. If there's a danger of oversimplification in identifying causes of wars, there's also a danger, as you are rapidly going to find out, in the extreme complexity of this subject. Numerous different methodologies have been used to try and make sense of the phenomenon of war, including, for example, meteorology, one of the most distinguished early studies of the incidents of war by Lewis Fry Richardson was by a distinguished meteorologist, and there may indeed be some similarities between war and the weather in the unpredictability, the capacity to produce storms, and in the complexity of statistical methods that are needed to analyze them. So that issue of complexity has to be accepted. There'll be many other methodologies. I shan't go into all of them, but just to underline the point that it is a complex area. My own listing of the causes of war includes 33. Each of them has been offered as an explanation of the causes of at least particular wars, whether civil or international. Some writers and a few political leaders have identified one or another explanation as leading inevitably to war. Others have seen them as contributing factors. Now, if I were to proceed now in this lecture to list my 33 causes, I would be in obvious difficulty. I would outdo the picture of the crusty and tedious Oxford Don who was heard walking down the high street saying to another Oxford Don, no doubt equally crusty, and 14thly. It's not the way we normally conduct arguments. So I will spare you a listing of all the topics, but try and give you an idea of them. And the first category concerns human nature. Many have attributed war to fundamental aspects of human nature. The fear of the other, herd mentality, willingness to obey authority unquestioningly, greed, unconscious urges towards destruction, all that and more. Secondly, belief systems. And here I will just mention 4 of the 5 that I have jotted for myself. Religious doctrines I've already covered. Another belief system, of course, is aggressive state ideologies, such as Nazi and fascist doctrines. Thirdly, social Darwinist beliefs in the inevitability of struggle, whether between states, ethnic groups, or social classes. Fourthly, and perhaps controversially, visions of a reformed international order, including visions based on Marxist, Leninist, and liberal ideologies, especially where such visions imply a need to impose a particular social system on other countries or even on the rest of the world. And in that sense, the revolutionary Islam that was initially pronounced as its goal by the Islamic Republic of Iran is very similar to the idea of a universal world state, which was alive in the early months and years of the Soviet Union. Now, you can easily think of other religious, other belief systems that might also lead to contribute to conflicts. Thirdly, actions of states and other bodies in the international system. Not so much the nature, although that is one category, but also the particular actions. Here one might include rivalry over resources, whether land, water, oil, gold, minerals, or what have you. Then there's claims to recover lost territories and or to protect by military means a country's fellow nationals living in another state, both of which can obviously lead to military friction. General great power rivalry, including in the relations between rising and declining powers. Secret treaties have often been mentioned as one cause of war, where governments cynically commit their forces to action in a particular case, but don't tell their publics, and the result was widely believed by the advocates of the secret treaty theory to be a major cause of war. This list of actions by states is extraordinarily long, and we can perhaps come back to some of that in the discussion, but I just want to mention the last part of this category, the failures of defense, deterrence, and order on the part of states. This is really just another branch of the actions of states that I mentioned already. This includes, for example, weaknesses of international institutions, including failures of the UN Security Council, due in part to use of the veto. It includes military weakness of states, which can facilitate external intervention and contestation within their territory. Think of the way in which Belgium, for example, was a victim and focus of the beginning phase of the Second World War in Europe, and indeed of the First World War too. Then there's a breakdown of order within states, power vacuums and so on. And I should mention appeasement as a policy which sometimes leads to war, as it plainly did in the 1930s, when the policy of Britain and France and some others of appeasing Germany contributed to the eventual outbreak of the Second World War. Now, some of these presumed causes are, in my view, too general to be analytically useful. Let's take the first, the nature of human beings. Obviously, it's true in a sense, just as it might be true that road accidents are caused entirely by the existence of cars, or vehicles, I should say, to be more logical. It's logically correct, but it doesn't tell you why some vehicles are more prone to accident than others, or some places are more prone to accident than others. So all the differences between a necessary condition and a really effective cause come up to play when one considers a case such as that. The listing of cases, of causes that I've offered shouldn't be taken as a listing of completely separate causes. In almost all wars, a great number of factors come together to explain why a series of dubious or even a series of understandable decisions eventually result in war. And indeed, in most spheres of life, when there is a disaster, it has multiple causes. And frequently, even what may appear to be a completely simple accident may actually have a complex chain of causes. Take, for example, the case in Britain of a British ferry visiting Europe, where a car ferry sailed out to sea with its bow doors wide open. Actually, it took an awful lot of mistakes to result in this insane outfit, which resulted in the loss of the ferry and the loss of many lives. And incidentally, so complicated was the chain of responsibility deemed to be that nobody was actually punished for this astonishing state of affairs. To accept the absence of a unified general theory about the causation of wars is, in my view, not a disaster. Such an acceptance can be a positive aid to understanding if it helps us to recognize the extraordinary variety of human societies, the uniqueness of situations, and the complexity of human motivations. It reduces the danger of intellectually narrow-minded approaches to security issues, obsessed with one single kind of causation or threat. Indeed, the sheer variety of widely recognized causes of war may paradoxically be a cause for actual celebration. It's compatible with the proposition that although some causes of war will always exist, they do not always lead to war. And it leaves open the door to other approaches to thinking about the incidence of war in modern societies. These include evidence that there has in fact been a reduction of international war and the role of international order in contributing to such a reduction. Here is a table, my main reason for resorting to PowerPoint in the first place, because it does strike me as illustrating rather vividly the decline of international war since 1945. Let me explain. It's a table of armed conflicts by type, covering a period of 70 plus years, and working from the bottom, the blue category is wars in the overseas colonies of European states. Obviously, over the years 1946 to the 1970s, that category goes dramatically down as events such as the Malayan emergency or repression of revolts in various African countries and so on come to an end, and there is independence is recognized. So that is no surprise that that should have declined. The red, or orange as it is there, represents interstate wars. That's to say, international wars between states. And there you see there has been a dramatic decline. The grey is internationalized intrastate wars. That's to say, internationalized civil wars. Civil wars in which outside parties get actively involved on one or both sides, as, for example, has recently happened in Syria and Yemen. And the yellow represents what they call intrastate wars, civil wars. Now, these figures, this is based on statistics from the Uppsala conflict database at Uppsala University. Now, all statistics, and especially statistics about war, need to be treated with an extreme degree of caution. I have indeed had occasion to cross swords with Mary Kaldor, whom you mentioned, on that very point. And in particular, the way in which some academic sitting at a desk in Uppsala works out how to classify a war, how to count one war as one war or as several wars, all of those are really tricky questions. So take this with a grain of salt, but nevertheless, I believe that the underlying picture it shows is clear and important, tells us something about the era through which we have lived. The Uppsala data shows something else, not just the decline in incidents of war between states since 1945, but also, as some other tables from the Uppsala database show, a decline in the numbers of casualties of such wars. And that in itself has changed the phenomenon of war significantly. It's not true of all wars, but it is true of many. And it's particularly true, or it has become particularly true, of Western wars of intervention. That the numbers of casualties suffered by British or American or French or other intervening armies in recent conflicts has been, by historical standards, relatively low. Now, some other studies support the idea that there has been a really significant change in international relations. Many of you may have heard of, may have read Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which has an extremely interesting statistical analysis, and once again, health warning with statistics, but of the decline of violence in human societies generally. It's not uncontested, but to my mind, the weight of the evidence is rather persuasive. And this doesn't just encompass war, it encompasses murder. And interestingly, he sees a decline in violence in many different types of society, whether democratic or authoritarian or anything in between. Much of his analysis, it seems to me, is cautious and reasonable, and he nowhere claims, as he is supposed to have claimed, that the long peace is either all-encompassing or permanent. But he does see that there has been a significant trend. He recognizes, and I'll come back to this, that a major source of violence in the world today is the after effects of decolonization. Now, other explanations include the change in the culture of debate about uses of force in the post-1945 world, where defense has been seen as the main justification for use of force. The Article 51 of the UN Charter and other significant public pronouncements, including by national leaders, have put the focus on the idea that the one really strong basis for using force is defense, and using force offensively is much more questionable. Now, one can't say that's had 100% observance or anything like it, but nonetheless it may have contributed to that reduction in violence. Equally, one has to concede, I believe, if one is to be intellectually honest about this, that nuclear weapons may have played some part in the destruction, in the diminution of armed conflict. Nuclear weapons form the reductio ad absurdum of warfare. Indeed, in past ages, a number of philosophers indicated a wish that there could be some weapon that would be utterly destructive, because only by that means might war be abolished. So there are many other possible considerations that could and are widely seen to have played some part in the reduction of international wars. Now, a quick word about what some writers say about this. I'll quote from Ezar Gat, an Israeli scholar, in his book on the causes of war and the spread of peace. And he says, all in all, to the extent that modernization, sparked by the industrial and technological revolution, most notably its liberal path, has fundamentally reduced the prevalence of war, indeed totally eliminated it from most developed parts of the world, the reason for this change is that the violent option for fulfilling human desires has become much less promising than the peaceful option of competitive cooperation. There's a hint in that of the old idea that trade is an alternative to war, and that provision for free trade or relatively free trade can consume human energies, competitive urges satisfactorily. The decline in the incidence of international war has been sufficiently impressive that even subscribers to the realist school of international relations, with the famous belief that states are destined to be concerned above all with the pursuit of power, that's their very nature, and it's a serious point of view that needs to be taken into account. But even Robert Jervis, who's a distinguished specialist in international relations, who is a subscriber to the realist theory, he even calls himself a realist with a capital R, but he begins a deeply reflective article on force in our times with this caution. A look at the past should make anyone hesitate to discuss the future of force. In 1811, a sensible person would have predicted that the coming century would be extremely bloody. In 1911, an informed observer could be quite optimistic. It is perhaps this knowledge that leads me in 2011 to see a mixed, but still fairly bright picture. And he goes on to express a degree of optimism at the end. He says, much realism argues that the anarchic structure of the international system leads to recurring patterns, many of them involving violence, and rules out long-term peace. There is much to this perspective, but cost-benefit calculations, norms and values can and have changed over time. That's a pretty major confession for a realist to make. Now, all of that suggests that something valuable has been achieved in the years since 1945, but it doesn't suggest that we have perpetual peace or anything like it. Indeed, there is an extent to which parts of that peace are dependent upon and remain dependent upon various forms of deterrence, conventional as well as nuclear. Now, I'm going to say a very brief word about the problems of the post-Cold War era. Many hoped at the end of the Cold War that we were entering a new era where there would be a long peace. And the assumption made, which in my view was completely faulty, was that all conflict before the end of the Cold War in 1989 or thereabouts, all conflict was to do with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been responsible for the Malaya emergency of the 1940s and 50s, and umpteen other attempts at revolution. If you accepted that simple view of post-1945 history, then it's understandable that you might think that there is no basic major conflict left in the world. But if you take a different view, that many of the conflicts in the world have deep roots in our own societies or in particular regions of the world, then that hope seemed naive. And I have to say that Asia in general was healthily resistant to that kind of post-Cold War optimism, because the Cold War itself had a rather different incarnation in Asia. Now, the way in which wars broke out within relatively quickly after the end of the Cold War demonstrated the multiple nature of causation of wars and the likelihood that there would be some continuation. The wars that I was most conscious of, being a European and having actually been there during the war, were those in Yugoslavia, where it is interesting that the fundamental beginning of the process of Yugoslavia falling into conflicting political entities was the holding of a general election throughout the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, in which every single party competing in the elections in all 6 of the republics of the Federal Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, all political parties fought on an ethnic or ethno-religious platform. So as soon as the question came up of how the Yugoslavia might fall apart, all those other elements came in. And equally, we have seen the emergence of terrorist movements as another reminder that the post-Cold War future is not exactly the optimistic world that was forecast, and that wars may have many causes. And incidentally, one of the regrets I think one should have about the events of the post-Cold War period is the way in which it was quite widely thought that the world was so new and so different from what had been before that history was almost irrelevant. So there wasn't enough thought given to the way in which, for example, terrorism can lead to major international war, as it did in 1914, when it was a terrorist act that led the Habsburg monarchy to declare war on Serbia. The hornet's nest, he called it. And that actually ended up with a war that was catastrophic for the side that launched it, a fact which was barely noticed, if at all, at the time of the commemorations of the First World War. That this was, from the Habsburg point of view, from the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy point of view, it was a war to extirpate terrorism, and instead it had the paradoxical effect of extirpating the Habsburg monarchy. Of course, our own wars on terror, including the Iraq War, had effects almost as paradoxical as that. Now, I will just lastly say a word about 21st century fears of major war. On the troubles with liberal international order, we are now reading quite a few almost obituaries for the international order that allegedly was, and that we are in process of losing, and among other things, it is suggested that Trump and the changes in American policy are part of that process of abandoning an international liberal order for who knows what. But the fear is that it might ultimately involve some resort to war. Now, there is a fault in that analysis. This wonderful liberal international order that we are supposed to have had at some not entirely precisely specified date was not necessarily seen at the time as exactly a liberal international order. The term seems only to have entered into common currency in this century, not at the time when it was supposed to exist. And so one needs to take with a little grain of salt the disappointment that we are losing a wonderful era. But it is true that if you use the more modest term, rules-based international order, there is a somewhat greater willingness to tear up legal agreements and to place less emphasis on the role of democracy in international politics than there was before. And that's one of the factors that's led alarm bells to ring. Then there's the decline of confidence in US power, a decline which is felt in many different countries. I've just been recently in Australia, and a number of writers have used the phrase fear of abandonment about the international situation of Australia, that it has historically relied on, invariably provided troops for the US alliance, and now, like many other countries, including, I dare say, Singapore, doesn't know exactly where things stand. So that there is that decline of confidence. And if you take the view that US power and reliance on it was, among other things, had a tendency to be stabilizing, and in particular contributed to the non-development of nuclear weapons by a significant number of states that could well have made them, then there is a problem arising from the change in US status. Thirdly, of course, the rise of authoritarian governments. And you don't need to be a full-blown Enlightenment philosopher seeing authoritarian government, or monarchies in particular, as a unique threat. You don't need to go the whole hog in order still to worry that authoritarian governments may be somewhat more war-prone than others. And then there's the whole thesis about which Graham Allison has written about, of the rising versus declining powers, and the possibility that war could result, that war does often result from this transition phase when one power is losing out to another. And it is possible to interpret some past wars in precisely that way. However, I would warn against any assumption that there's anything like automaticity in it, that it is inevitable that a clash between rising and declining power will lead to war. On the contrary, there have been a number of cases historically where some powers have risen and others have declined without there being war between them. And it's striking that some writers talk about this as an inevitable type of clash, and they claim to do so on the basis of Thucydides' famous observations about the causation of the Peloponnesian War. I think that they're trying to turn Thucydides, who had a large and capacious mind, into a somewhat simpler, one-dimensional figure. They're trying, in other words, to convert him into a pure, straight realist, when he was much richer than that. But ultimately, I think the lesson to be learned from our encounter with violence in the post-Cold War period, as also perhaps of the larger survey which I've tried to summarize for you, is that the multi-causality of war, the complexity of causes, has one welcome side effect, which is we should beware of any notion of the inevitability of war. And one of the biggest problems, which I was not able to discuss in this lecture, has been that sense of inevitability that has come from certain particular theories about war, such as the social Darwinist view that conflict was absolutely inevitable. And to get back to the theme that was mentioned, that I mentioned at the beginning about accidental war, there is a curious accidental element about the whole theory of social Darwinism, that theory that human beings, like all other species, are destined to compete ruthlessly with each other. The only reason why Charles Darwin's book on evolution had the term favoured races in its title was because the publisher wasn't satisfied with the existing scientific title and wanted something that would sell a bit more. And hence Darwin, at his own initiative, put the mention of favoured races in his title that was quickly interpreted to mean something completely different from what he had intended. So in the history of thought about the causes of war, there is a major role for accident, as well as in the actual causes of war. And perhaps that's an appropriate point at which to let you take forward the discussion. Thank you very much.